What would you do if your HOA slapped you with $250,000 in fines for rules that never even applied to your land, only for you to later prove in court that you actually own the very ground beneath their million-dollar homes? Picture opening your mailbox to find not one, not two, but a growing pile of letters from the neighborhood association, each demand harsher and more intimidating than the last. This became the daily struggle of Anthony Reed, a 48-year-old mechanic who thought he had finally found peace when he bought a few quiet acres in Riverton. Instead, reverse was the case. The morning sun had barely risen over Riverton when Anthony Reed pulled a thin white envelope from his mailbox. He turned it over in his hand, frowning at the block letters stamped across the front. Notice of violation. At first, he thought it was a mistake. He didn't belong to any neighborhood association. His home sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, bought with the savings he had scraped together over a decade of double shifts as a mechanic. The property wasn't inside anyone's gates. That was the very reason he bought it. Freedom, space, a chance to breathe without somebody dictating what color he could paint his shutters. Inside, his wife Camila was setting plates on the breakfast table when he walked in, envelopes still unopened. Their daughter, 10-year-old Aria, looked up from her cereal. "Daddy, what's that?" she asked. "Junk mail, probably," he muttered. But his voice carried a tightness he didn't intend. Anthony tore the flap, slid out the letter, and read the words twice to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks. Unauthorized structure detected. Fine assessed, $500. His jaw clenched. The so-called unauthorized structure was his shed, the same shed he'd built with his brother one sweaty summer years ago, the one that now stored Aria's bikes and his old lawnmower. He looked again at the letterhead. Riverton Meadows Homeowners Association. He almost laughed. His house wasn't in Riverton Meadows. His land predated the subdivision entirely. They'd built their neat cookie-cutter homes next door, but their fence lines stopped at the old creek bed. Everyone knew that. Camila came closer, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" Anthony passed her the page. She scanned it, her brows knitting. "They're fining us? That can't be right." "I'll handle it," he said, though his stomach churned. By the end of that week, another envelope arrived. Then another. Each one stacked higher than the last. $1,000 for an unsanctioned gravel driveway. $2,500 for a non-conforming fence. Even a $200 penalty for excessive exterior lighting. Camila watched as the pile grew on the counter. "They're harassing us," she whispered one night when Aria was asleep. "They're going to bury us in paper until we break." Anthony tried to shrug it off. He'd lived his whole life pushing back against people who thought they could control him. But the letters kept coming, their tone sharper each time. Final notice. Escalation pending. Legal action recommended. Neighbors began to whisper. When Anthony drove into town, he noticed familiar faces turning away, conversations cut short mid-sentence. At the grocery store, a man from the subdivision muttered loud enough for him to hear, "Some people think rules don't apply to them." Anthony said nothing. But inside, something hard and cold was taking root. One evening, his longtime friend Marcus stopped by. Marcus was the kind of man who carried calm wherever he went, a counselor at the local high school who had guided more troubled teens than he could count. He leaned on the kitchen counter, flipping through the stack of notices. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said flatly. "Your land isn't part of Riverton Meadows. They don't have jurisdiction." "Tell them that," Anthony replied. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "They're banking on fear. That you'll pay just to shut them up." Anthony shook his head slowly. They picked the wrong man. But the harassment only escalated. Board members of the HOA began holding meetings where his name was passed around like a cautionary tale. Non-compliant, they called him. Defiant. He became the villain of their manicured paradise. Parents pulled their kids closer when he walked by. Cars slowed when he mowed his lawn, drivers staring as though he were a spectacle. One night, after the 4th week of notices, Anthony sat at his desk long after Camila and Aria had gone to bed. The glow of the computer screen lit his face as he scrolled through property records, deeds, and county filings. His grandfather had owned this land before him, and his father before that. There had to be something in the paperwork that proved what he already knew in his gut. They had no claim over him. File after file slid across the screen, legal language that made his head ache. And then he saw it. A small, easily overlooked entry tucked in the records of a business acquisition he'd made 5 years earlier when he invested in a development company with a few friends. The company's name was forgettable, a bland string of initials. But the entry showed something extraordinary. The holding company hadn't just purchased a strip of land for access roads as Anthony thought. It had acquired the underlying title to the very soil Riverton Meadows had been built on. Anthony froze, staring at the words. Slowly, a smile crept across his face. The board thought they could bully him into submission. They thought they held the power. But the truth was staggering. Their neatly lined homes, their perfectly trimmed lawns, their gated pride, all of it sat on land controlled by a company that Anthony himself still held majority shares in. The shed, the driveway, the porch light, none of it mattered now. The game had shifted entirely. But as dawn crept through the curtains, Anthony knew something else. If he thought the discovery would end the conflict, he was wrong. This wasn't the finish line. This was the opening shot in a war that would shake the entire neighborhood to its foundation. Outside, sprinklers ticked across the lawns of Riverton Meadows, glistening in the rising sun. Behind those gates, people whispered about the stubborn mechanic on the edge of town, the one who wouldn't bend to their rules. They had no idea what was coming. And Anthony Reed, sitting in the quiet of his home, staring at the deed that changed everything, whispered to himself, "They think they own me, but they're standing on my land." Anthony did not sleep much after the discovery. He lay awake listening to the old pecan branches brush the roof and thought about lines on paper that could move entire lives. When the alarm finally chimed, the house felt too quiet, the kind of stillness that follows a storm and promises another. He poured coffee and told Camila he would attend the Riverton Meadows board meeting that evening. She set her cup down more carefully than usual and asked if he would bring the new documents with him. He said he would bring what the board needed to see and keep what they did not deserve to hear. She understood that answer without another word. By afternoon, the neighborhood Facebook page had already sprouted a row of posts about an unauthorized structure owner who planned to disrupt the meeting. Anthony ignored them. He drove Arya to her friend's house on the other side of town so she would not feel the air of a fight when he returned. Marcus met him in the driveway as the sun leaned low, that steady calm still in his eyes. He wore a plain blue shirt and a look that belonged in a counselor's office, not in the middle of a subdivision's power struggle. "You sure you want to do this?" Marcus asked, not because he doubted Anthony, but because true friends are supposed to ask. "They dragged me in," Anthony said. "I am just walking to the front of the room." The clubhouse sat across from a man-made pond braced by neat stones and a pair of ornamental geese that never changed position. A lemon cleaner's smell hit as the door opened, sharp and artificial. Folding chairs stood in exact rows, and the fluorescent lights hummed like a warning. People filled the seats with a tense obedience that said they came to be told what to think and hoped to leave having done so. At the head table sat the board. The president wore a navy blazer even though the heat lingered, silver hair combed like a closing argument. Richard Caldwell had the posture of someone used to being the tallest voice in a room. Beside him, the vice president, Patricia Lang, shuffled papers into perfect stacks and peered over delicate glasses at any disruption as if order itself were a personal friend. They looked up together when Anthony walked in with a slim folder under his arm and Marcus at his side. Whispers thinned the air. A woman in the second row nudged her neighbor and tilted her chin toward him. A man near the aisle folded his arms as if his posture could raise a wall. Anthony did not scan for allies. He took a seat in the front row because he wanted no one between the board and the words he would say. Richard tapped the microphone and greeted the room as if the outcome had already been decided. He moved through landscaping updates and pool filter replacements with a practiced rhythm that made governance sound like a checklist. The room obliged with patient nods. Then he flicked to a printed agenda item labeled Ongoing Compliance Matter, Border Parcel. "As many of you know," Richard said, "we have worked for weeks to bring a neighboring property into alignment with Riverton Meadows standards. Uniformity protects everyone's investment. Exceptions threaten that." The board has acted in good faith to correct violations. He did not speak Anthony's name. He did not need to. A murmur coasted over the chairs like a small wind. Patricia raised a hand toward the audience. We will keep comments orderly. Members first, guests after. Anthony stood without waiting for an invitation and said that he would speak as the person they had been finding for a shed, a driveway, a porch light that had never shone inside their gates. Richard's smile stayed in place, but the corners of his eyes shifted. He gestured toward the microphone stand meant for public comment. Anthony walked to it without hurry and rested his folder on the small metal ledge. I listened to your updates, he said, voice even. I heard the word uniformity 5 times and the phrase good faith 3 times. I do not object to either in principle. I object to your reach. My property is not, and has never been, part of Riverton Meadows. Richard laced his fingers and leaned back like a judge about to teach a lesson. There is a common misunderstanding, sir. While your parcel lies beyond the primary gates, our bylaws extend to bordering lots for aesthetic consistency. That provision has stood since the community's inception. Anthony opened the folder and slid out a single page. It was not the deed that would end the argument. It was a county parcel map printed in clean grayscale with a bright pen line marking the fence like a boundary in a child's coloring book. He held it up so the first 2 rows could see and then set it on the ledge where the board would have to look to avoid looking guilty. Your bylaws end where this fence ends, he said. The county recognizes that boundary. Your own filings recognize that boundary. I brought a copy for your recorder. Patricia took the paper without moving from her chair and glanced at it with the speed of someone who has already decided not to agree. This is out of context, she said. Bordering provisions are clear. Show me the line that says you can enforce inside my gate, Anthony replied. A low stir ran through the room, not loud enough to be chaos, loud enough to be felt. In the 3rd row, a woman with a soft scarf and a careful voice raised her hand. Her name, written on the attendance clipboard, was Janet Morales. She had lived in the subdivision for a decade and paid every invoice on time. She had taught her children not to stand on principle without facts. She looked toward the head table rather than the man at the microphone. Mr. Caldwell, Janet said, if the county map shows the boundary cleanly, and if his deed does not include the annex language, are we spending our dues to fight a case we cannot win? A few heads turned as if a quiet rule had been broken. Richard did not look at her when he answered. Mrs. Morales, thank you for your concern. We cannot allow a single parcel to flout standards. A neighborhood is only as strong as its rules. Janet did not look away. Strength and legality are not the same thing. Patricia rapped her pen twice against the table, a small sound that tried to be a gavel. Please hold comments until the floor opens. Richard's smile hardened a degree. He faced Anthony again. You have built an unauthorized structure, applied gravel that does not meet our specifications, and added lighting inconsistent with community norms. These are not arbitrary. They are the backbone of property value. Anthony inhaled slowly and let the breath ground him. He thought of Camila rinsing breakfast plates and Arya tying bright laces on her sneakers. He thought of the first time he stood on this ground as a young man and felt a kind of quiet that did not depend on anyone's permission. I built a shed on land that is mine, he said. I added gravel where county trucks bogged down in heavy rain. I installed a light because my daughter rides her bike in the evening. None of those acts fall under your authority. What you are calling standards, I am calling control. The word landed with weight. Control was a mirror that sat poorly on certain faces. A man in the back stood up suddenly and asked why people like Anthony always wanted special treatment. The phrase people like carried enough history to sour the room. Marcus turned toward the voice and said nothing, because nothing would serve better than quiet in that moment. The man sat back down, chastened by the force of his own echo. Richard lifted a hand as if to smooth the tension he had helped create. We will not descend into personal insinuations, he said, with a cadence that pretended neutrality. This is about rules. If you refuse to comply, the board will escalate through the legal remedies available to it. Anthony closed his folder and held it at his side. If you want a courtroom, he said, choose one with a judge who reads maps. Patricia leaned into her microphone. Let the record note the respondent's refusal. The board will proceed to a vote to authorize formal legal action. The motion sounded like a ritual. A second came quickly from a board member who had not spoken all evening. Hands rose along the head table in a tidy row. Janet watched without moving. The vote passed with the inevitability of a script some people write for themselves so they never have to examine their lines. Before Richard could declare the meeting adjourned, Anthony asked to make one more statement for the record. Patricia frowned and began to refuse, but Richard played magnanimous and allowed 30 seconds. Anthony used all of them. "You are not protecting value," he said, looking at the front table and then at the rows behind it. "You are protecting control, and you are doing it with other people's money. You are finding a man who does not owe you anything, and you are selling fear to neighbors who deserve better facts. You can take me to court. When you do, I will bring what you refuse to see tonight." Patricia reached for the microphone again and announced that public comment had concluded. Richard declared the meeting closed with a pleasant tone that did not match the room. Chairs scraped against the tile like a dozen small objections. Conversations rose in overlapping lines. A man near the exit muttered that the board was right and that if one person ignored rules then everything collapsed. A woman replied that collapse looked a lot like writing checks to lawyers for fights that maps already decided. Neither convinced the other. The air tasted like static. Marcus touched Anthony's shoulder as they stepped into the warm evening. The pond lights threw shaky reflections that made the water look unsteady. "You kept the big piece out of the room," Marcus said. "Was that hard?" Anthony watched two kids on scooters roll past with elbows out and heads high, carried home by parents who did not want them to see adults argue about fences. "It was necessary," he said. "People deserve to learn the truth once, in the right place, with no one shouting over it." They walked to the truck, and a board volunteer hurried after them with a tight smile that never reached his eyes. He handed Anthony an envelope marked with a law firm's logo that had more serif than sense. "Courtesy copy," the volunteer said, and then he rushed back inside before courtesy could turn into conversation. Anthony slid the envelope into his folder without opening it. He would read it at his desk with the same calm he brought to every stubborn bolt on every stubborn engine that had ever crossed his lift. He would call a lawyer in the morning, not because he needed courage, but because paperwork speaks a language that requires fluency. He would kiss his daughter goodnight and tell his wife that the vote had gone as expected. He would sleep a little better knowing that next steps no longer belonged to the rumor mill. On the drive home, Marcus watched the subdivision recede in the side mirror. "They will say you came to make a scene," he said. "They will say you are stubborn." "They can say both," Anthony answered. "They cannot say they were not warned." A porch light glowed on his own house when they turned onto the gravel. Camila opened the door before he knocked, as if she had felt the truck pull into the drive from a mile away. She listened while he told her about the vote and the way Janet's question hung in the air like something reasonable looking for a place to land. She did not ask whether he had revealed the deed. He did not need to tell her he had not. She put a plate of food in the oven to warm and asked if he wanted tea or quiet. He chose quiet because he wanted to hear the house breathe. The envelope from the law firm waited on his desk. He slid it open with a small knife and read a letter that pretended to be polite. It contained the usual phrases about demand, compliance, and action to recover costs, written in a manner that hoped big words would do the heavy lifting of legitimacy. He read it twice, not because he doubted the words, but because reading carefully had saved him more than once in life. He set the letter beside his county map and then reached for the other folder, the one with the document that would not be introduced in a room scented with lemon and crowded glances. He touched the edge of that paper like you touch a match before you strike it, aware of heat, mindful of timing. He looked out the window and saw the fence line that had formed the edge of a subdivision's confidence. Beyond it, the clubhouse lights dimmed to night mode and locked the doors behind their owners. Inside those walls, a board would tell itself it had taken a stand for standards. Inside this house, a man decided to let a judge hold the map. He turned off the lamp and let the room settle. The night outside did not care about bylaws. Crickets argued in their small voices without consequence, and the stars performed their jurisdiction without asking permission. Anthony closed his eyes and felt the particular calm that comes when a path finally narrows to a single, straight mile. He did not feel like a hero or a villain. He felt like a man who had been told to kneel and had decided to stand. The next step would not take place in a clubhouse. It would happen in a courtroom where paper and limits mean what they say. Morning would bring signatures and calendars and a file stamped with a case number. It would bring voices he did not invite and outcomes no one could script. It would bring the same truth he carried into the meeting and carried out again, unspent and intact. He would place it on the only desk that mattered. He would watch a gavel fall on claims that did not reach past defense. The lights across the pond finally went dark. The neighborhood slept under the impression that it had won something. Anthony slept under the knowledge that he had not yet shown them what the word standing means. The letter from the law firm lay on Anthony's desk for 2 days before he carried it into town. He had read it enough times to memorize the rhythm of its threats: failure to comply, demand for payment, legal action authorized by the Riverton Meadows Homeowners Association. Words intended to intimidate rather than persuade. On the third morning, he tucked the envelope into his folder beside the deed that told a different story and drove to the modest office of Renee Callahan, a lawyer recommended by Marcus. Renee was not the kind of attorney who decorated her office with diplomas and framed photographs shaking hands with local politicians. She kept the blinds open, the furniture plain, and her desk stacked with active cases rather than trophies. She read the letter in silence, her brow lifting only once, and then asked Anthony to explain his situation without interruption. He laid out the timeline, the notices, the fines, the meeting, and finally, the overlooked detail about the holding company. When he finished, Renee leaned back and said, "They don't just lack jurisdiction. If what you're telling me is accurate, they've been acting outside the law for months." Anthony nodded. "I kept waiting for them to back off once they realized the boundary. Instead, they doubled down. Because they think pressure works better than proof," Renee replied. She tapped the letter with one finger. "They'll file. We'll respond. When we walk into court, you don't need to argue passion. You need to argue standing. Without standing, the entire case collapses." That evening, Anthony told Camila and Marcus that the next step was no longer hypothetical. The HOA was taking him to court, and he was prepared to answer. Camila listened without flinching. She had grown tired of whispers at the grocery store and neighbors who suddenly forgot how to wave. Marcus set a hand on the table and said quietly, "Good. Sunlight belongs in courtrooms." Within a week, the official summons arrived. The envelope was heavier than the earlier notices, its weight designed to signal importance. The case name stretched across the top: Riverton Meadows Homeowners Association versus Anthony Reed. The number beneath it became a mark that would trail him through the coming months. Word spread quickly. By the next board meeting, residents filled every chair and lined the walls, eager for updates on the legal battle. Richard Caldwell announced with measured pride that the board had taken necessary legal action to protect property values. Patricia Lang assured everyone that their lawyer, Clinton Avery, was highly experienced and confident in the case. They spoke like generals rallying soldiers for a war that had already been won, even though the true fight had yet to begin. Anthony did not attend that meeting. Instead, he stayed home with Camila and Aria, sitting at the kitchen table where the stack of notices still rested like a monument to stubbornness. He explained to Aria, in words simple enough for her age but clear enough to hold weight, that sometimes people in power push where they have no right, and the only answer is to stand still until they exhaust themselves. She asked if the neighbors were mad at them. He told her some were, but that truth has a way of outlasting anger. The first pretrial conference arrived on a damp Tuesday morning. Anthony walked into the Williamson County Courthouse beside Renee. The building smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. In the hallway outside the courtroom, clusters of Riverton Meadows residents whispered as if they were spectators at a play. Gregory Caldwell and Patricia Lang stood with their attorney, all three projecting confidence for the crowd. When the judge called the case, the parties filed inside. Gregory sat upright, his chin lifted, while Patricia scribbled notes as though speed could manufacture legitimacy. Their lawyer opened with a speech about standards, uniformity, and the importance of protecting investments. He spoke as though Anthony's refusal to comply threatened the very fabric of suburban life. When it was Renee's turn, she rose without drama, unfolded a parcel map, and laid it on the bench before the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "this case rests on a single question. Does the Riverton Meadows Homeowners Association have jurisdiction over Mr. Reed's property? This map, recorded with the county, shows the subdivision boundary. Mr. Reed's land lies beyond it. He is not, nor has he ever been, part of their association. The date for the first full hearing was set for the following month. Between now and then, the neighborhood would simmer with rumors, and the board would tell themselves they had the upper hand. But Anthony knew what sat inside his folder, waiting. When the time came, he would place it on the judge's desk and let silence do the rest. For now, he closed his garage door, turned off the lights, and stood alone in the driveway under the Texas night. The subdivision across the fence glowed with porch lights and trimmed hedges, each house convinced of its order. They did not know how fragile that order was. They did not know that beneath their manicured world, the ground they stood on belonged to the man they had tried so hard to break. Anthony whispered into the quiet, not for the neighbors to hear but for himself. They're building their case on land that isn't theirs. The courthouse in Williamson County looked different when Anthony walked through its doors for the full hearing. The air carried more weight, as if the walls themselves understood that something larger than a neighborhood dispute was about to unfold. Reporters stood outside on the steps with cameras ready, their lenses waiting to capture whichever side appeared victorious. Inside, the gallery filled quickly with residents of Riverton Meadows, their conversations low but urgent, the sound of a community pulling apart seam by seam. Anthony walked in with Renee beside him. She carried a slim briefcase, her face calm but sharpened by focus. He carried nothing but the same folder he had brought to the HOA meeting, the folder that contained the map, the letters, and the deed that no one had yet seen in public. Marcus sat in the gallery near the front, his steady presence a quiet anchor. Camila had chosen to stay home with Aria, knowing that gossip and glares were better faced without a child in tow. At the plaintiff's table, Gregory Caldwell wore the same navy blazer, but his posture was tighter now, his smile less fluid. Patricia Lang shuffled papers quickly, her hands moving as though speed might summon certainty. Their lawyer, Clinton Avery, radiated confidence louder than either of them, striding with the energy of a man who believed courtroom theatrics could outshine substance. Judge Helen Whitaker took her seat with the unhurried authority of someone who had seen hundreds of cases and was immune to performance. She adjusted her glasses, called the case, and invited the plaintiffs to begin. Clinton rose smoothly, buttoned his jacket, and spoke as if the gallery were a jury rather than spectators. "Your Honor, this case is about fairness and community standards. Riverton Meadows is a development built on uniformity, a promise to every homeowner that their investment would be protected. The defendant has disregarded that promise, erecting unauthorized structures, ignoring regulations, and refusing to pay fines now exceeding $250,000. The HOA has no choice but to seek enforcement." He turned to gesture at Gregory and Patricia, both nodding with practiced solemnity. Then he raised his voice slightly. "Without rules, order collapses. Without accountability, property values crumble. Mr. Reed has been given every opportunity to comply. Instead, he has chosen defiance." The gallery murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uneasily. When Clinton sat, Renee stood without flourish. She placed a single document on the podium and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, this case is not about fairness. It is about authority, and whether the plaintiffs ever possessed it. The HOA has issued fines against my client for rules that do not apply to him, because his property has never been annexed into Riverton Meadows. Their reach ends at their fence. Tonight, we will prove they have been punishing a man for the crime of living outside their gates." She handed up the parcel map, the same one Anthony had shown at the meeting. The judge studied it carefully, nodding as she traced the dark boundary. Anthony remained seated, his hands folded calmly on the table. He glanced at Marcus, who nodded once, eyes shining with restrained pride. Renee packed her briefcase without hurry, her movements steady. As they walked out of the courthouse, a resident called out, "Is it true? Do you own the land under our homes?" Dozens of heads turned, waiting for his answer. Anthony paused at the top of the courthouse steps. "The truth is this," he said evenly. "The HOA has no authority over me. The rest is for the court to confirm." He did not linger for applause or anger. He descended the steps with Renee and Marcus, leaving the crowd buzzing behind him. That night, back at home, Anthony sat on his porch with Camila. She held his hand, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. "It feels like a storm broke open," she said softly. "It did," he replied. "And the wind hasn't stopped yet." Across the fence, Riverton Meadows glowed under its street lamps, but the neat rows of houses no longer looked unshakable. Inside those walls, neighbors questioned the board they had trusted, wondering if their leaders had dragged them into a fight they could not win. Anthony leaned back in his chair and whispered into the night. "They thought the fines were my punishment. They didn't know the land was my defense." The storm had only just begun. Weeks stretched between the recessed hearing and the final ruling. In Riverton Meadows, the silence was anything but quiet. Neighbors whispered in driveways, tempers flared at grocery aisles, and the once pristine clubhouse became a theater of suspicion. Some demanded Gregory and Patricia resign immediately, furious that dues had been spent on what now looked like a reckless crusade. Others clung to the board's warnings, convinced Anthony Reed was plotting to seize control of their lives. Anthony did not answer gossip with gossip. He spent his days in the garage fixing engines and his evenings with Camila and Aria, trying to let his daughters see that her father's worth wasn't determined by rumors. But every time he glanced at the fence line, he felt the tension pressing against him like heat rising from asphalt. Marcus checked in often, reminding him that storms always sound worst right before they break. The morning of the ruling, the courthouse gallery filled faster than before. Reporters jostled for seats, microphones angled like weapons ready to capture triumph or defeat. Gregory sat stiff in his blazer, lips pressed into a line that betrayed nerves he refused to show. Patricia's papers trembled faintly in her hands. Clinton Avery whispered strategy, though even his tone carried less bravado than it had weeks earlier. Anthony entered quietly, Renee by his side, Marcus close behind. He felt no need for dramatics. The truth was already in the judge's hands. Judge Whitaker called the room to order. She spoke slowly, each word deliberate. After reviewing the evidence, deeds, and filings submitted, this court finds that the Riverton Meadows Homeowners Association has no jurisdiction over Mr. Reed's property. Furthermore, the fines levied against him are without legal standing. The court dismisses the claim in full. No payment is owed. Gasps rippled through the room. Relief broke across some faces, fury across others. Reporters scrambled to their feet, eager to beam the decision to every corner of the state. Gregory slumped in his chair, his jaw tight with humiliation. Patricia stared at her papers, eyes glassy, as if the ink itself had betrayed her. Anthony remained still for a long moment, absorbing the weight of the words. No payment owed. The $250,000 of threats dissolved with the stroke of a gavel. Justice had not just spoken, it had shouted. Outside, residents swarmed the courthouse steps. Some confronted Gregory, demanding answers for months of wasted money. Others pressed toward Anthony, voices sharp with questions. Was it true? Did he really own the land beneath their homes? What did it mean for their mortgages, their investments, their peace of mind? Anthony raised a hand for silence. "I didn't come here to own anyone," he said firmly. "I came here to defend what's mine. The court has spoken. The fines are gone. The truth is simple. Authority must stay inside its boundaries. When it doesn't, it becomes abuse." The crowd buzzed, some nodding, some glaring, but no one left unmoved. Reporters captured every word, their headlines already writing themselves. Court sides with homeowner against HOA. In the weeks that followed, the HOA fractured. Gregory resigned quietly, slipping a short statement into the newsletter without facing his neighbors. Patricia followed soon after. The association still existed on paper, but its influence had shrunk to a shadow. Homeowners who once followed its every directive now rolled their eyes at its memos, tossing them into the trash without a second glance. For Anthony, victory did not feel like celebration. It felt like survival. He returned to his routines, mowing his yard, working in his shed, sipping coffee on the porch.